Okay, we're back here at Behind Open Doors, where we take you behind the scenes, discovering what it takes to multiply followers, leaders, and new churches. I am Aaron Danini, Executive Director of the Multiply family of churches, and that over there is
Nick Lombardi.
He
president.
is the president of the Multiply family. And, we're getting here together today, once again, back on the podcast to talk a little bit more about followership. And some practical aspects of that, but it's been a good season so far. A bunch of episodes, kind of laying that foundation of what followership is: Old Testament, New Testament, Jesus, the church, and kind of what that looks like for us today. Plurality, followership on the mission field, and how we build capacity and help people do those things. And today we're going to talk about the way to follow. The way to follow. So, what is the way to follow? Nick, tell us all about that right now. Everything you got. No, but seriously, for you, how has your following of Jesus in a sort of meta sense developed since you become a Christian? Give us a paragraph. Like, you were this, you're that, and you hope to be that.
Yeah, wow. I can give you a long paragraph, maybe.
I want a long paragraph.
Well,
whatever you want. Go ahead.
Yeah, the introduction that I had to, so for people who don't know my background, I went from as far away, and this is kind of true of my personality now that I think about it, that, I went from as far to this side as possible, not being a follower of Jesus, to very into being a follower of Jesus and figuring that out, what that was. And one of the first things that ever, kind of immediately following the conversion experience, I found myself on my first ever Christian retreat, which was probably something you shouldn't do, maybe if you're a recent convert. But the whole thing was taught by a guy who eventually became a bit of a mentor of mine, and his whole thing was Jewish studies. He wasn't kind of classically trained in Hebrew, but he was learning it later in life as a pastor, and that became his focus. So the whole retreat was really focused on understanding the first century followership, discipleship, and that has been my baseline ever since. And so where I was not following. Everyone's following something, and I was following the ways of the world, and much worse, to almost immediately seeking to follow the original kind of Jesus in the first century light. And my long term is I've never shied away from wanting to explore that more. I've never found something more intriguing for me personally.
That makes actually a lot of sense. Kind of thinking about it live, I've never heard you say that. So biblical language is kind of your pursuit in the MDiv, and it kind of deals like that. You wanted to unpack some of that, I'm guessing. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Interesting.
Liberty, actually, where I went to seminary, they offer an undergraduate degree in Jewish studies, and not a master's level. But if I could do it all over again, I'd be a deep, I think, Jewish studies undergrad person.
Interesting.
Yeah.
In the dust of the rabbi, huh?
Yep.
Interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah. For me, I grew up in the church, Christian family, Christian home, ran away from God, rebelled, and came back. And when I came back, I listened to a lot of the radio preachers, and the only way I could describe it at 20 years old at the time was they taught with depth that I hadn't experienced really in the past. And what I found that out to be is that it was a gospel-centered preaching, and a biblical preaching that went sort of expositionally through the text. And voila, here we are, 23 years later ish. And that's something I'm very, very passionate about still, so it's funny how in your early stages, you sort of got mentored in that kind of way. You still enjoy those things. Same here. I got sort of latched on to that sort of style of model of understanding the Word of God, understanding the gospel, and it's still a passion of mine, as well as I'm, worked through different areas of preaching and teaching and study and education, all that stuff over the years. So it's funny.
And there's a period of time in my life that I'm recently more coming out of, where I would have said that's the wrong approach entirely. I don't know, there's probably not a wrong, we're all on our journey and that kind of thing, but it's that way of doing things,
What's that way? Sorry, just
diving into knowledge
Okay.
and theology, as more of a revivalist point or a starting point for the discipleship journey. It's I guess it's not wrong. I'd say it's modern. It's more modern. If you look at the sort of all of religious history, especially the last 2,000 years, up until America 1900s, really, like if you became a recent convert and you showed up at church, they would tell you something like, okay, lesson 1, here's how you fast. Lesson 2, here's how you pray. All right. And it's a much more modern phenomenon where we kind of turn to this, okay, you're a new convert, start coming to Sunday school and we're going to unpack Romans for you, 1 week at a time for a year. I don't know, better or worse. That's a kind of a separate discussion, but
Yeah.
It's different.
Yeah, interesting. I think one of the things that this is getting into our topic now. One of the things that I was maybe a little bit frustrated about as a young Christian was that when somebody said we need to make disciples, or the Great Commission call is to make disciples of all nations, and I always felt like that was a mystery. Like, so what does that look like? How do we do that? Jesus said, make disciples. Okay. And maybe that's my sort of engineering, business mind, analytical mind, where I'm like, all right, so what's the process? What are we looking at here? How do we do that? And I never felt like I was doing it right, because I wanted this sort of checkbox process to figure out how to do it. And so I think what we've tried to do here at Multiply is create some of those check boxes and some of those pieces to say, all right, here's the kind of the list of tools and items and things that you should be working on as you grow as a disciple of Jesus. So I think those things are important, but certainly what I've learned though over the years is that there's a very organic component to disciple making and developing followers of Jesus as well. And that you can't really do one without the other at some point. If you have an organic approach, that's great. That's awesome. Relational, all these things. But in order for that to be reproducible for a larger church organization, prevailing church model, there's probably going to have to be some things that are more organized and more systematized in some ways that people can latch onto to grow from and help use as tools in their tool belt along the way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and again, as I sit here today, and I know your checklist kind of pathways, I love it, and it's so helpful. It's helpful for me. I'm trying to steal a bunch of it for TGC, as you know. I'm fully there, but I think what you're hitting on is something that isn't talked about a lot, which is in theology. We, in our tradition, in our circles, are huge on this correct hermeneutic. That we are careful about what we believe, and by first following like what we call a hermeneutical bridge, what was the original understanding of this? What was it originally saying? How was that originally understood? And then how can that be applied to us universally for all time and that kind of stuff? Almost never in our traditions do I see a similar effort put in for like what would be orthopraxy, right? Like, okay, this is what was done. How do we understand how it was done in its original context? How do we understand what that meant? And then how do we apply that for all times, like universal? Like one of the things I didn't even understand in seminary was that the Great Commission, we call it great because it was Jesus who said it, but he was not the first person to say the words in Matthew 28 and what we call the Great Commission. In fact, it was a very normal traditional ceremony that rabbis did a commissioning for their disciples who were ready to move from the phase that they were in to this phase where they began to bring on their own disciples. And like just unpacking that fact for me has been like I struggle with so many things understanding that. And I'm like, why have more people not struggled with this? Because I think that the disconnect that you expressed, that you felt, it makes sense to me because, well, we need to first understand what it was like then and what was meant then, and then figure out what that means for us today, where we really don't have a ton of people doing that. And again, one of the things I like about Multiply is that I think this is an attempt to kind of do some of those things and fall back so that we understand what it means to be a follower more so. Like one of the major questions, I was a big, and I'm still a big, everyone should be making disciples. Everyone should be making disciples. Everyone's a disciple maker. Everyone's a disciple. Yes, maybe. But seeing what it looks like to be a mother of multiple young children in America today, who's also working a full-time job, who's also taking on a lot of duties in the home, that the way it falls, is that really the right phase to be a disciple maker and to be commissioning disciples, that kind of stuff, right? And if Jesus was commissioning only his disciples, that were a limited number of people, that were leaders he had raised up, and commissioning them with this command to make disciples, is there something important there to uncover about the fact that he didn't do that to 3,000 people at a time, right? Anyway, all that to make the point that I think there's so much to uncover there that I just hope people kind of dive deeper into. And I think if we do that, it will help us more with this dissonance between what when people try to understand discipleship today and then reading the scriptures and being like, this doesn't add up.
I think is there a piece of this that is also us bringing our kind of cultural biases to the text as well, and the way we, in our sort of Western mind, organize thoughts and organize systems and processes and all those kinds of things, where we're almost approaching the scriptures looking to read into the text some systematic theology or some Jesus sent out the 72 2x2 and this was his leadership strategy, and so we tag these sort of leadership strategies and these sort of popular terms onto the things that are happening in the text, which in the time were just happening. Like, in some ways, yes, Jesus was likely strategic about his life and how he was living it and what he was doing, but we sort of bring our own ideas to the text and interpret Jesus's life based on our experiences or what we know culturally, when in fact, I hear what you're saying, some of it is like he may have been doing something completely different that we don't realize because of our cultural barriers that we have to overcome. Is that also a piece of this understanding the discipleship process too?
Oh, I think it's a huge piece of it. You mentioned a phrase there that's an ancient Jewish Israelite phrase, which is a rabbinic phrase, which is like, it's a tremendous blessing, basically, to be covered in the dust of your rabbi. And there's a book that I read very early on that retreat was kind of based on this, and it's called "Covered in the Dust of Rabbi Jesus." And that phrase comes from this idea that that to be a follower of the way, which originally the translation there, that's probably most original language there, is actually follower of the anointed. Like when we read Christian and that kind of thing into it, follower of the person that they thought was anointed. What that meant was that, like, your life, right, was so intimately connected to the life of the rabbi that there was almost like a competition as to who was the rabbi's favorite at that point. Because the rabbi, as they were walking, say, from town to town, that if you were the favored disciple, you were walking so close to the rabbi that the dust of his sandals would kick up the dust and it would actually land on you. And that was a great blessing because it meant you were the closest to the rabbi, right? Mm. And so the part of this dissonance for me was like, I learned that very early on. And I'm like, none of us live our lives that way, right? Like so imagine you're, a first century 16-year-old, which many of the disciples likely were, and you don't have access to the internet. You don't have access to a radio show. You don't have access even to, like, the way we think of education. You don't have access to books. getting knowledge, getting information, getting mentorship, learning how to become something that's not just a subsistence farmer or something along those lines. The only way that you could do that was by getting as close as you could to somebody, getting permission to follow them around so intently. There's a blessing that rabbinic Jews would say in about the 2nd century, I think it started, that was like, they would say a blessing or a prayer for a thank you for a bowel movement. And so often followers of that rabbi would fight to be as close as possible to the rabbi when he was going to the bathroom, because you could hear and learn about his relationship and his followership to Yahweh based on the blessings he recited when he had a bowel movement, which, thank you. It was like, thank you for this orifice that allows the stuff to not get, like, that's the guy. And if you were a follower, you're like, oh man, that little tidbit I just learned, like now I can say, I understand how to be thankful for a hole in my body, right? That's okay. So I become a Christian, right? And I'm like, well, I got to live my life like that. If I started following around anyone that closely when they're going to the bathroom, I'd end up in jail, right? And then discipleship over, right? So all that to say again is like, what does it look like to take this truth? And I think this is where our series on followership has been so helpful, because it's like, well, followership, the way we talk about it, it pulls out these principles of like zeal, mission ownership, right? Deference. How much deference does it take to be anyway?
We should write a book called Crappy Followership.
Crappy Followership.
Like
There's one book out there called Dirty God that dives into this a little bit, like trying to understanding Jesus, like going to the bathroom and that kind of stuff. Like, oh, okay, the life that he really lived. But yes, I think you're absolutely right. Like we need to do some serious work in our followership in our own lives to get to know that better, and then think, what does that mean? What does that look like today?
Yeah. So we've mentioned this sort of phrase, the way, and I put the title today, the way to follow. And the idea there is that, the earliest Christians were called people of the way, and there's a pretty popular title out there, the way, what is it called now? The John Mark Comer stuff? Practicing the way, yeah. Right? And then you have a document that you wrote up for your church folks called The Way, that kind of compiles a bunch of things. And
I wrote mine before Mark.
That's true.
Important.
That's true. Yes, exactly.
Not as well read, but
but still very well done. And so the way to follow, and what we're trying to get at here today is really what is the way to follow? Like, what is the way to follow Jesus? We're supposed to make disciples of Jesus. That 2 Timothy 2:2 from Paul speaking to Timothy, that says to teach faithful men who will teach others also. So there's supposed to be this ongoing teaching and this really multiplication of the gospel through discipleship into people, and then multiplying that out into our families, our households, and into the world. So that we say it singularly, they're practicing the way. Here is the way to follow. But really, that it spirals into this web of lots of different ways, it seems like, that are all really one way.
Yeah.
Remember that old Hillsong, "One Way, Jesus," right?
I think I was still in the streets probably for that one.
All right. Sorry. Yeah, all right. Robbie remembers. Cool.
Okay, cool.
But there's there is the way that happens to be lots of ways.
Yeah.
How do we untangle that web, as it were?
Well, if I can continue to play the first century Jewish card, right? Jesus kind of famously said, and often we hear it quoted or preached on, right, that his yoke was easy. His yoke was light. What did he mean by that? I've heard it preached a million different ways. I rarely have heard it preached, again, looking at the original kind of context. But the word there that's used for yoke is the same word that is used colloquially then for the list of rules. It was, a noun that basically meant it's the list of rules that a rabbi had contextualized to their own followers and followership methodology. So when we say the way, really what that was a way of sort of proper nouning Jesus's particular yoke. It was the most popular yoke following his death kind of that existed. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of those yokes, of those ways. Jesus became the way because it was recognized by Christians as really the only yoke that they could take on that led to salvation and eternal life and celebrated the resurrection. And all the other ways, all the other yokes were no longer an option inside the rabbinic tradition because they didn't lead to eternal life. They didn't lead to Jesus. They didn't lead to the Son of God and those kinds of things. So it really originally was this, it's a list of practices. John Mark, I think, got this exactly on, is like a list of things that you did that mimicked the things that Jesus did that he passed down to his followers. Yeah. And again, this is where you like immediately run into trouble. And it's like, well, Jesus said to his followers, like, the way we're going to do this is don't take any bags with you. Don't take any money with you. Like, we're just going to live off the charity. And so again, you hear people talk about like, oh, that's how we're supposed to live. We're supposed to vow of poverty, give it. Well, that was a rabbinical teacher who in that culture lived off the hospitality of people. They worked half the time as like, oh, he's a carpenter. Yeah. So what he would do is, he'd work a little bit as a carpenter, then he'd take 3 weeks or 4 weeks or something. And he would go travel to the towns around Nazareth and around his area. And he would kind of go on loan as the teacher. And the people would support him to make up the income he was losing in his carpenter gig. And that was the way they kind of passed information on. Okay. Well, what does that mean for us today? What does that way look like? I don't want to sell everything that I own. And even if I did, I don't know that it'd make me a better teacher walking around without a bag to carry my stuff in. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I don't know. I'll ask you, what do you do with that? What do you do with the way, how clear is Jesus's way today?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is part of the problem that I think most Christians have, sort of more broadly speaking, is, they can only define it through their own experiences and what they have done or what their parents have done or their grandparents have done as Christians. And that is the basic stuff, right? We go to church on Sunday and maybe a Sunday school or a small group during that same day or during the week sometime. And we do our best to love people. We do our best to, make all the right decisions, do all the right moral things. And I think in our culture especially, a lot of it is interpreted in the way of Jesus is a certain type of morality that we must live by. And then in some circles, it's like, and if you don't, then he'll get you. It's kind of like the clearly not that's a non-grace-filled life, but it is certainly an aspect that sort of cultural Christians would think, like, I gotta do the right thing. Yeah. In fact, you even have Christians that will say, like, if something happens good in your life, I had this happen not too long ago in this church. Somebody said, well, you must be living right. And I'm like, really? Is so that's the measure of living right? Is, that's kind of a colloquial saying I think that we have. But so I guess that's what I'm getting at today, is that it can be so confusing because of all the cultural pronunciations we put onto Christianity. And what we're trying to do, I think, is pull back all those things to say, but what really is the way of Jesus? What really is the making disciples of Jesus? And what does that look like? We can't help but see it through cultural lenses at first. And I believe we're arguing for pulling back some of that or taking off those lenses at least to really try to see what Jesus was getting at when he was teaching.
Yeah, and one way that Brianna and I, my wife, we're trying to, something you said, something ironic, I think, about what you just said actually is that the defining characteristic of the way, Jesus's way, was its lightness, was its lack of emphasis on moral code. And it's ironic that in our culture today, like you said, is absolutely true, that it really became the opposite of what had made it so popular and kind of Jesus's point, right? He was actually famously eschewing a lot of those hard moral rules, you couldn't heal somebody on the Sabbath. He's like, I'm going to heal people on the Sabbath, right? Because his way was lighter. His way was easier. And it's amazing that that's exactly the thing that we've gotten so wrong in so many different.
Yeah, we're the new Pharisees in some
Right.
ways, at least in the Western culture anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, but like one of the ways Brianna and I we're taking a look at how we do church, which is something we focus a lot on at TGC, and we're moving towards every meeting, every week, every time you meet, in any circumstance, you have a meal together. I think this is one way, we're calling it like the Dura church model, where you incorporate liturgical elements into the home, and you incorporate the Lord's Supper into the home. And one way that you can do that differently in a home, if you're not in an assembly meeting, is like we're gonna because I think hospitality and I think community were something that were deeply a part of the way, fundamental to it. And so I would say, no, not to try to jump to a answer, but I think doing more things like that would be a way of following the way and becoming more like Jesus. I think showing deference to the Father and to Jesus in your life is a way that we can extract a universal principle from the way and do it today. I think mission zeal. How well do we understand the mission of Jesus? What was he trying to do here? Something that's kind of become a bugaboo for me is like, man, we typically talk about the mission of Jesus like he was born to die and then raise again. Yes, but no. He was born and came to earth to become king of everything, heaven and earth.
Yeah.
So where's the,
and to restore, right? And to redeem.
Yeah. The kingship part, right? Like following that kind of thing. So there's a lot more in there, sort of unpack, but I think the first step is really taking a deep look at what those universal principles are that we can extract and then checking them in our own life.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna try to land the plane with here, is that we have to look at the core principles that Jesus espoused and live and breathe those in whatever space we happen to be in. So we are a more prevailing model church at the church where I pastor at Ocean View, and so you're going to get the more traditional model, at least here. So you're going to have worship music. You're going to have hospitality teams greeting you in the morning. You're going to have preaching of the word. You're going to have some classes or small groups that are going on for kids and adults, and you're going to have a mission emphasis, kind of the 5 pillars of what the church is. Right, Rick Warren talked about these years and years ago. Right, and what I think we're saying is that all of those things are aspects of discipleship or of following Jesus, and it doesn't really matter what space you're in. Now, that is not an argument for not being a part of a local church. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that following Jesus looks a lot like fellowship, teaching, worship, mission, hospitality, all these things in whatever space that you're in. So any tools or resources or systems or processes that we have in place, even at Multiply or at our prevailing churches, at the Dura churches, anything that we have that's sort of listicle that you can kind of check off and get through, and say, I did this, now I'm a disciple of Jesus. That all of the tools that we have out there are designed to get at your heart ultimately, because all of this is a heart matter. Jesus came not to do away with the law, but to fulfill it and kind of and allow that to be what is the seat of our hearts now that we are living out how we were designed to live, even though we are still in this fallen world. So getting at those heart matters are what all those tools and resources that I was looking for years and years ago, those tools and resources would have been helpful and would have maybe been helpful to see where I am on some sort of growth pathway. Yeah. But in the end, I could do all the stuff that I want and still be far from God if my heart is not there,
Yeah. And I like the pathway knowledge, the pathway wording, and that's particularly helpful, right? Because I would say, especially the one that Multiply continues to develop and implement in the field, is that, we can't follow somebody around for, a typical follower that was following a rabbi like Jesus. They would start following between 13 and 16. One of the reasons why Jesus sort of disappeared after his appearance in the temple and then didn't come back till he was 30 is because, quite literally, if you were following a rabbi, or if you were in that sort of learning phase, is you completely laid down your identity until the point when you were ready to get commissioned to go out, and then you became a rabbi, and then you got a name, and then you had your own way and your own yoke. And it's okay, now you're somebody. But that deference was so important to the process of becoming like your rabbi that you had to really, it's almost like you'd see in the army kind of stuff, no identifying factors, you're just one. But we can't do that, right? We don't have, so let's say 14 years to follow somebody around it's just not going to happen, right? We can't do that. One way that you can take sort of a zoomed out view of what that might look like is a pathway, right? There's a literal pathway that says this is what it looks like to be far from God. This is what it looks like to kind of start checking some of those boxes, to be doing the things that Jesus asked his followers to do. Here's those things that Jesus started doing as a leader, and the ways he started building up as a leader. And then this is the way he started to multiply that. I think that's almost like getting a snapshot of the life of Jesus and the life of Paul and those kinds of things, so that, okay, I don't need 14 years. I can kind of see it all laid out before me. And then you can start on your journey following that its own way. So yeah. I think any kind of pathway, if you want to use the Multiply pathway, we'd love that, of course, but make your own. Maybe it's meet with your pastor, meet with your small group leader. What does it look like? What are those tools? And start collecting them and map them on your own and say okay, this is where I want to get to. This is where I'm at right now. And how do I go about doing that? Unless you do have the ability to go follow somebody around when they go to the bathroom for 14 years.
Yeah, don't do that.
There, a couple of tools that I like, the way that I wrote, I think that's, it's a collection of other kinds of things. One of the tools I use to create that is it's called Zume. Zume is the Greek word for yeast. It's a completely free tool that's now online. It's Zume.training, and it quite literally will help you track through a pathway of things that Jesus taught. I like that one a lot.
Yeah, that's good stuff. I think what's most important too with that is to, because we haven't said it explicitly, but is to say that please don't go through any sort of pathway process alone.
Oh yeah.
Right. Find somebody that's further along than you, and probably somebody that's a little behind you, and do this in a cohort of sorts together. I think that's the original assumption and design of this, is that that we're growing in community as we work through it. That's incredibly important in this.
Yeah. I would even say, I hear a lot of people talk about one-on-one discipleship. I know what they mean by that. But the model was small group, a few people to do it with. Havrim was the Hebrew word, and it was this cohort, but a cohort that was deeply connected to the pursuit of becoming something farther down the pathway. And I think there's something special that happens, the challenges, the things that you learn that happen between the people that are pursuing it together. I think super important. Yeah, for sure.
Yep, and the way we follow Jesus is done in a lot of different ways, but ultimately we have one head, one king that we follow, and hopefully we can equip you with some tools to be able to do that. Please reach out to us, Nick at multiplythechurch.com, Aaron at multiplythechurch.com, whatever ways you want, because this is really the heart of what we're trying to do, is to allow followers, leaders, and churches to have access to some of these pieces that you heard us say we didn't really feel like we had access to growing up as young believers. And we're trying to get these things in people's hands as best we can, whether we curate them ourselves or create them ourselves, or whether we are able to just hand over the things that we've learned. That is a deep passion of ours. So hopefully this will help, and it'll help you multiply your own followers and leaders that lead to potential new churches. We are excited to continue this pursuit. on the Behind Open Doors podcast. We'll see you next time.